With Trump's address to Congress last night, and visibly half the room never standing or never clapping during any part of his speech, not only have things gotten so politically charged post-COVID in real life, but also the optics on live TV are ever present and obvious. And with said charged environment, it feels like some sort of conflict or some sort of release of energy is necessary in order to have some sort of resolution to this conflict. And given that the last major conflict we were in was World War II, which was mostly an external crisis, the next closest thing we could really look at is the Civil War or the American Revolution. Of course, the American Revolution was against Britain, and technically we were still part of Britain, so it was kind of an internal conflict. The Civil War more closely resembles something of internal conflict over some issues in a similar light of what we're seeing today. That's why for the last few weeks I looked at this book, Fateful Lightning. Oh shit. That's why I looked at this book, Fateful Lightning by Allen Guelzo. It's a 500-page narrative about the Civil War, and most of what I'm going to talk about in this video will be based on this book, except for the part where I'm going to talk about our society versus society back then, the prelude to the war. So needless to say, you have a chance to pick this up because this book is fucking awesome. So if you're like me, I was born in 1997, and World War II was about 50 years before I was born. That already in itself is very hard to relate to because technology has gotten so good with the internet and instant communication so that relating to a society is very hard to do, especially if you didn't have grandparents who kind of told you how life was back then. So trying to relate 80 years even before that to the Civil War is almost like going into medieval times or another world. If you're like me, you find yourself interested in the 20th century. And off the top of my head, my understanding is not that bad between 1990 and say 1913. But pre-1913, my history starts to get really bad really fast. Hence why I found justification in looking for a book on the Civil War. Again, if you have the chance, pick this book up, read it for yourself. It's highly engaging, and I'm not going to be able to cover obviously everything in a 500-page book in a video on YouTube. But for someone who likes 20th century history, this book based on the Civil War was freaking awesome. It was really hard to put down, and I finished it in all of about 3 weeks. Hence why I haven't posted any videos recently. So the four things I'll be talking about are why the Civil War happened, how does it look compared to our world today, and then I'll focus on the actual battle itself, the fighting, the conditions, the arming. So really the majority of this is going to be focused on why the Civil War happened and how similar it's going to be to whatever conflict may be coming our way. Okay, so part one, why the hell did we even have a war in the first place? So for us to look at that, we have to go all the way back to 1860, right? The world is a super different place, so a lot of things that we consider common sense or just happened autonomously today obviously didn't happen back then. If you learned about the Civil War in school and anything really before 1950, school tried to make it about as boring as possible and very unrelatable. However, if you read this book, I promise it's going to be way more relatable, and it won't be a drag and a dry grind, just like our schools made it out to be. When we look at that world back in the 1800s, America had just beaten Britain twice in the War of 1812 as well as the American Revolution, and there's one key difference about America versus the rest of the world powers. America is this constitutional republic, and every other country at the time at least is still a monarchy. Why is this so important? Obviously monarchs want to hold on to their control, so if they see America being successful, that proves that that kind of system is possible, and popular sentiment would change so that monarchies would also have to be changed into that system. Therefore, America was seen as this kind of weird land that was kind of an almost experiment ground to see if these constitutional republic weirdo things could actually work, or if it's only a matter of time until they fall apart into monarchies. So before we look at the Civil War, we need to look at everything that caused the lead up to the Civil War. It needs to be stated that the American Revolution and the way it occurred was very important. Britain obviously pissed off the colonists, and even though the colonists did not agree uniformly on slavery, they agreed that it was more important to repel Britain back to their side of the Atlantic than to agree on the small details of what a constitution would look like if they were independent. So the colonies banded together with their differences as states into one country in order to join together and beat Britain. Now, once they actually beat Britain, obviously, as we know, not all the states wanted to give up their interests. The main advantages of the North were very different from what could be done in the South. The South had used slavery for a while, and they weren't just going to give that up willy-nilly. Don't forget that states were extremely compartmentalized. If you grew up in Pennsylvania or New York, you were basically staying your whole life in Pennsylvania or New York. Airplanes weren't around then. Traveling by ship was a pain in the ass and slow comparatively. So most of the time, people in their community never had contact with the rest of the states. And even though the states were very different in their own ways, there was a sense of camaraderie of some sort for having beat Britain and being part of a union. So the country obviously got this identity of being a union, and it was very important to the country back then. That's something that we always forget and was not emphasized necessarily in school. For example, James Madison was a Virginian, and in the War of 1812, the Bostonians who were getting blockaded by the British were fed up with the fact that a Virginian could go out of his way and declare war and then make the Bostonians suffer in another state hundreds of miles away. So as early as 1814, delegates from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts had actually met in Hartford to express their discontent with the war and considered seceding from the Union. Now, of course, those threats and even any sentiment of that ended because the War of 1812 had ended at that point, but the idea of secession at the time was extremely rare. But the point remains that people who are in their own areas feel complete and total resentment towards someone who has no identity in their life, and why should someone who's thousands of miles away in the case of the American Revolution, or hundreds of miles away in the case of the War of 1812 in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Delaware, be allowed to wage war or oppress colonies whose interests are vastly different than those given the orders? In 1828, a very controversial point was South Carolina, which was a huge state at the time, and its relationship to the Tariff of Abominations. It made it so that there was a 50% import tax, and they had to start buying American goods. South Carolina, which relied a lot on importing foreign goods, got screwed by this, and many other states that also imported stuff got screwed. Think about it this way. What if China, which makes a shitload of our stuff today, said, okay, yeah, we're going to slap on 50%. Suddenly that shirt that you're buying for $16 or $20 or $24 goes up from 16 to 24 or $24 to $36. You're going to respond to that, and that's on a small scale. What if you have to import 1,000 shirts for your customers at $10 a pop? Now it's $15 a pop. That's a huge fucking amount of money. And a lot of these percentages that we learn in school are so unrelatable until you put into real world examples like that. So with the Tariff of Abominations in South Carolina feeling very weak to manufacture its own stuff, such as tools and whatever else it was importing, it felt like the North and people who are hundreds of miles away were taking advantage of the state of South Carolina rather than trying to help them in their best interest. South Carolina just got screwed, basically. So with such a controversial tariff, South Carolina this time threatened to secede. The relationship between secession at the time with other states, ever since the War of 1812, had really been an empty threat and kind of like a bluff. If the North did anything too forward with slavery, the South was like, listen up, bitch, hey, if you want to keep doing this, we're just going to secede. So the North was very careful not to touch slavery too much and risk the Union falling apart. Don't forget, the Union of the United States at the time is its key component to success. Since the North could manufacture things reasonably well by the 1820s, this Tariff of Abominations really was not a problem for them, the way the problem was posed for those in the South. When we get taught about the Civil War in school, we basically see the South as one giant cohesive unit, and all the states had similar interests, and all the states were uniquely the same. All the states were not unique, they all believed in slavery in the same exact amount, and they use it as proportionally the same. However, this book does a phenomenal job of demonstrating that this simply isn't the case. It's really divided into 4 or 5 different regions. We see Group 1 is outlined in green. We can call them the Border South. It's comprised of Northern Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland. And yes, Maryland. Group 2 is going to be in purple. We have Southern Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Northern Louisiana. And Group 3, which is really what school says the entire South is made of, is different from the other 2 groups. We have Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. This is really where the true South is. When we look at Group 1, I guess you could kind of say that Southern Louisiana and Texas were kind of this other region. Don't forget that Texas became independent in 1836 and wasn't a state until about 1845, I think. Also, this map I should mention is 1861, I believe. I guess I should have included Missouri as one of the states, but it's also a unique state we'll go over a little later. In Group 1, we look at Kentucky, Northern Virginia, Maryland, and we see that cotton had long ceased to be the dominant crop. Soil exhaustion had driven farmers south, and slavery was mostly southward than this region. By 1860, Virginia and Maryland only had about 25% of the South's cotton output, and less than 33% of the population were slaves in Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Tennessee, and Virginia, compared to the appallingly huge numbers of 57% in South Carolina, 55% in Alabama, and 47% in Louisiana. Eastern Tennessee only had about 10% of the population as slaves, and Tennessee mostly grew wheat, not cotton. And that's part of Group 2. The hemp factories of Kentucky that used slave labor defended their decision as the slaves are more docile, more constant, and cheaper than freemen, who are often refractory and dissipated, and who waste time by going to public places, attending musters, elections, which the operative slave is obviously not permitted. Where have I heard this argument before? If we move everything back to the United States, where people are mostly pretty free, of course things are going to get more expensive. The whole argument of us moving a shitload of stuff to China is because it's cheaper. And how strikingly similar this is to the argument to move all the shit to China because they don't have as much shit to do, and it's a lot cheaper to not pay the Chinese than it is for us to make stuff here. It's just batshit fucking stupid. As long as I buy something and I don't have to directly deal with the slave labor, I want things to be cheaper. And by doing so, we should totally endorse things that are made by slaves. And you know, China isn't formally a slave country, but for all intents and purposes, it might as well be, right? Missouri was a fantastic example of a place that was a slave state, but really only certain parts of it and these small stretches were dominated by slavery. Most of the rest of the state was free, even if it was classified as a slave state. So between 1790 and 1860, nearly a quarter of all the slaves were moved into the new cotton states, and the slave population of the border states fell by half. So realistically, it was phasing itself out, at least in that upper region in the South. In 1860, half of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States at the time were in slave states. In 1860, 1 out of every 4 white families owned slaves in the South. Less than 1% of Southern families owned over 100 slaves, and only 3% owned more than 20. So slavery on a massive scale was not huge. The largest slave-owning families had between 1 and 4 slaves, and that accounted for about 50% of the slave-holding South. The largest group of people owned between 1 and 4 slaves, and that accounted for about 50% of all slaves in the South. So given that that's the case, it was a little more widespread than people make it out today. And do not forget that when you're the average farmer who's holding between 1 and 4 slaves, every single reason to resent the success of the large plantation owners of families that own more than 20 slaves was so easy for them to resent the economic success of those families, because they couldn't compare. If you only own 1 to 4 slaves compared to owning 20 or more, they're making shitloads more money than you are. Specifically, when I read that point in the book, I started thinking to myself, what the fuck is wrong with school? School made it out to be such a cookie-cutter, boring-ass fucking subject. And as you find yourself getting a little older like myself, you find it so much easier to relate to material like this, especially when it's put in terms with a narrative that the book suggests. Needless to say, slavery by 1810 in the United States was very much in decline. Some states like Pennsylvania and other states had a few slaves, but it wasn't a widespread practice, and by the time you get to 1830, it's basically non-existent and totally phased out in the North. A big reason for this is the northern climate as well as the soil was very inhospitable, unlike in the South, and therefore the North really had no enthusiasm to have slaves, maintaining massive farms and plantations because, well, those massive farms and plantations weren't really that widespread in the North, given the geographical differences. When you have this newly formed constitutional republic all the way in North America, which is kind of the weirdo side of the world, in the view of the Europeans, you've got these clown Americans running around trying not to be a monarchy, and you mean to tell me that they call themselves a free constitutional republic, yet half of them have slaves? It's a complete and total contradiction. So the monarchs in Europe were easily able to tell their subjects that America is not really a free land because they still have slaves over there. And what free kind of country that they claim to be would actually own slaves? So in combination with the North not really having too much motivation to have slavery at its root at the end of the day is really inefficient, even in the absolute shitstorm that is slavery. To be owned by another person on another side of the world because you were sold into it and traded into North America, enslaved blacks still try to make their masters' lives as irritating as an existence as possible. Blacks and slaves as a whole, for matter, don't just sit around and take it passively. They tried to make it as joyless as possible to own another human being, plain and simple. I mean, in general, with how inefficient slavery was, it brings up the question, why would you even have slavery in the first place? I mean, it's not like these guys are just taking and sitting down. They're going to abuse farm animals. They're going to make sure that unless you're directly watching them, they're not going to do anything. Do you think slaves are just going to respect farm tools, or are they going to try and break them when they can? Try to put in their little resistances. A quote from the book. There's hardly one of our servants that can be trusted to do the simplest work without being stood over. And if I ordered a room to be clean or a fire to be made in a distant chamber, I can never be sure I am obeyed unless I go there to see this for myself. This level of micromanagement is astoundingly a huge pain in the ass. Think about it. When your boss tells you at your job to do something, you do it because you're getting paid. So if you're not getting paid, would you really want to do it? The answer is hell no. That person better have a cattle prod and start zapping you before you start doing it for free. One of the answers the book proposes to why in the world would you have slavery if it's such an inefficient system in the first place is because the South saw themselves as very different than the North. It promoted their peculiar kind of culture. The South thought of themselves as more gracious, leisurely, and had more sense of a past than those in the North who were seen as an army of faceless wage workers in a factory. And therefore the men of the South were noble and knightly because, yes, I own the slaves in Mississippi, oh ha ha, I'm much more superior to you. So one of the main points is that even though slavery was pretty inefficient, it still promoted huge profits to the South. By 1860, half of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States were enslaved states, and the single wealthiest county in the U.S. at the time was Adams County in Mississippi, one of the true South states. To give you an idea of how powerful the slave trade was in the South and how much money it promoted for them, because after all, the South was basically a glass cannon of literally just exporting shitloads of cotton to Britain. If the South were an independent country in 1860, a year before they fired on Fort Sumter starting the Civil War, it would have been the 4th most prosperous nation by itself, surpassing France and only falling behind Britain. Now, I tried to look this up, and Google's not exactly the most forthcoming when it comes to stuff like this because, well, record keeping back in the 1860s, you're really starting to fight an uphill battle. Trying to find aggregate macro things like this is pretty tough to quantify. However, to put the South as making as much money as on the scale of some of these big European powers goes to show how much fucking money these Southerners were making, at least the wealthy ones. Now, when we look at the slave state, one of the most important things about this whole balance of powers was really the Compromise of 1820 that started a lot of it. Missouri would join as a slave state, Maine would join as a free state. This kicked the can down the road to be solved at a later point, but for the time they were at least happy because the balance of powers was even. For example, if you have all these new states coming in and all of them are going to be free states, well, the slave states know that they're going to be phased out at some point because they're the minority. However, on the same token, if you're the free North and you have all these new states being joined as slave states, it's probable that amendments will get voted to make sure that slavery is a practice that's absolutely allowed, and therefore all the people who want to be slave owners in the North will have to take it up. So this balance of powers to make sure that you're in the majority and that your opposition doesn't gain a majority is very important. Because don't forget, America was still in an expansionist phase. When we look at this map of the United States in 1820, right around when the Missouri Compromise was about to take place, we see that the United States is a very different world back then. The entire country is based on the East Coast, and really the Midwest, but the majority of the power players are on the East. This was the big question of the time. If a state joins the Union, will it be a slave or free state? And if it is a slave or free state, what will it do to the balance of powers right now? So of course they kick the can down the road for the next 40 years. So with the manufacturing of the North, by 1850, the South only had a quarter of the total rail in the country, and only 20% of the manufacturing capacity that the North had. Acre for acre, land was worth double what it was in the North, and on top of that, in the North, illiteracy was only 5%. Contrast that with the South, where illiteracy could be as high as 40% in some parts, so illiteracy was much higher in the South as a whole. Of the rail that the South had, which was a lot less, the Southern rail was really only for cotton haulers and getting cotton to the coastline, where they could ship it off by boat, and thus most of their economy, which again was wholly cotton-based, didn't really justify the need for too much rail line, and not that strong, durable rail. Britain and the South had a huge trade relationship because Britain's bread and butter was a strong textile industry. And what do you need for industry back then? Shitloads of cotton, which the South had. The book claims that there could have been as much as 588 million pounds of cotton being shipped to Britain every year, making cotton such a disgustingly profitable crop that you'll do anything just to protect it, even if it involves the use of slaves. And it's not like they had an alternative to slaves, because that means they'd have to invest a shitload of money into manufacturing plants and into a job market, which if you have all that money, you don't really want to start buying up. If you have all that money in the first place, you don't want to start investing in that if you don't have to, and you can get stuff from cheap slavery. And this cannot be understated. They lived and died by cotton. Most of their money was from cotton. As a comparison, the North exported about 5% of what it made, and that pertained to mostly just wheat, while the South shipped an enormous 75% of what they made overseas. One of the other key factors of the North not turning to slavery the way the South did and trying to phase it out was religion. Religion in the North was very important for persuading against slavery in general. Now we're getting to kind of the 1840s. I know this isn't the most chronologically ordered thing of all time, but I'm trying to give you as many factors as I can in the shortest amount of time without making this video 15 hours long. When we look at the amazing state of Texas, Texas of course was part of Mexico, and Mexico had just become a state in 1821, having fought for their independence. So Mexico is not particularly organized at that point as a strong power, so a lot of people went west to Texas. Now the deal that the Mexicans and the Texan settlers made is that they were going to switch to Roman Catholicism, and they were also going to speak Spanish. Texas had about 20,000 people in it by the end of the 1820s, and by 1835 it actually had 30,000 Americans living in its borders. So when there aren't that many Mexicans in Texas in the first place, and you have all these shitloads of settlers that are blatantly ignoring your laws, kind of like we have today in the United States, they aren't switching to Catholicism, and they're certainly not speaking Spanish. This starts to really piss the Mexicans off and creates a lot of friction. Also, they had about 1,000 slaves there. When you have 30,000 settlers that are ignoring your laws, and you have a tiny amount of Mexicans in comparison, way less than the 30,000 Texan settlers there, Texas decided to be cheeky and declare independence from General Santa Anna in 1836. Now, Santa Anna's not going to stand for this, and he gathered about 4,000 people, and one of his first places to attack was the Alamo. They had barricaded themselves in, and they tried to make it as difficult as possible for the Mexicans to get to them. Granted, there were about 200 or 300 of them, and they killed about 400 to 600 Mexicans. So of course they went out swinging, but the main sticking point was that they were all executed. No prisoners were taken. The Texans used the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," and eventually when they captured Santa Anna, he forced them to recognize Texas as independent from Mexico. Now when Santa Anna got back to Mexico City, he said fuck that shit and double-crossed him. So Texas kind of got to this point where they were trying to join the USA anyway, but under President Martin Van Buren, and this is not talked about too much, at least at school, but the Texans had run a huge fucking debt, and the United States aren't exactly happy about assuming that debt and taking Texas in with them. So Van Buren says no, and Harrison was kind of the same accord, saying fuck that, we want to make the American citizens' experience as good as possible, we don't want to assume large debt bills that we don't need to. So Texas was unwillingly its own independent republic for quite a few years. Then comes Polk right after that, and Polk was massively expansionist, so there was no doubt once he was elected that Texas would be assumed into the Union. Polk was trying to even aim at the Oregon Territory, which was still divided with the Great Britain at the time. Now, once the Mexicans withdrew their diplomats from Washington, Polk sent Zachary Taylor to the border with 1,500 troops, and 10 months later in 1845, there was a clash. Now, this debated the Mexicans into attacking the Americans, and therefore they didn't just stop at Texas, they went all the way to California, and once the Americans won, they said fucking fork it up, bitch. So all that territory was no longer Mexico's. And you can kind of see here on Ducksters.com, with its really shady quality, that in the green they basically gained all this land. Yep, that's right, Mexico got debated. And don't forget, even though the USA beat the Mexicans, they still paid for the land. Now, a huge sticking point is the Compromise of 1850. Of course, when you're in school, you learn about compromise this, compromise that, and you think, fucking all these compromises are bullshit. bullshit, right? The Compromise of 1850 changed some serious things, and I would go as far as to compare it to be similar in a lot of ways to the COVID lockdowns of 2020 and 2021 in various states. Here's why. The Compromise of 1850 had finally stopped showdown over who would rule which states, and the Compromise of 1850 allowed popular sovereignty, which meant that the settlers could vote for whatever they wanted. And this sets the stage for Bleeding Kansas. Now, as time goes on, the northern opinion of slavery is turning colder and colder. A lot of this is due to the new Fugitive Slave Law Act. The law stated that basically, slave runaways from 20 years or more could be captured and re-enslaved, even from the north. Obviously, this is fucking appalling that someone could live their life freely for 20 years and then get thrown back into the South. That's almost unthinkable, really. Fines of up to $1,000 back in those days, which is a shitload of money, could be issued if they were harboring fugitives and didn't cooperate in capturing proceedings. And the last part is really where the North started to lose its shit with this, because they were made accomplices and made out to betray and seize runaway slaves, which had always been free in the North, as far as the people at that time could remember. This is where we have to remember, before the Civil War and after the American Revolution, each state was super compartmentalized. So like I said before, someone from Pennsylvania, someone from New York is never going to see anyone from Mississippi or Georgia or North Carolina, and the two cultures are going to be so incomprehensibly different. So now you have this Fugitive Slave Law Act, which means that you, as someone who's ignored slavery for your whole life in the North, now have to be an active participant and can be punished if you're not doing so, from what we saw. That's a huge flip from the way that they lived their life before. Northerners basically thought of it as some distant moral issue, and now they have to consider how they would act if a federal marshal should summon them, which is a very direct in-your-law face, kind of like COVID was for us in 2020. Northerners who never even thought about slavery were now witnessing public executions and extraditions of runaways that were demonstrably repulsive. Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 was an inspirationally brutal tale of slavery, and in those days, it managed to sell 300,000 copies in its first year. Northerners who were fine with this out-of-sight, out-of-mind kind of thinking found themselves dragged into this horseshit and in cooperation of maintaining slavery that the South wanted, in a very direct, in-your-face manner now. This was one of the biggest changing points right before the Civil War, in my opinion. Now we get back to the idea of popular sovereignty in the new states. In Kansas and Nebraska, there's something called Bleeding Kansas. Basically, looking at this map again, we see here that Missouri would be surrounded on all sides by free states if the state of Kansas is allowed to be a free state. So both slave and free states had interest in going over to Missouri and fucking with the popular sovereignty. With about 3,000 eligible voters, 5,400 votes were cast for pro-slavery, and it was obvious that the election had been corrupted and stolen. Also, it's easier to kill off opponents than to outvote them, so killing them was warranted. In total, about 55 to 200 people were killed, which in those days is kind of a lot of people, especially in a country that had a lot of cities with small populations, and most of the populations weren't in the big cities, they were in small areas like this. Now we get to John Brown, and John Brown and his state had heard about the killings and moved to Kansas in 1855, and him and his crew of boys dragged out 5 pro-slavery farmers out from their beds while they were sleeping and hacked them to death very violently. When John Brown killed some of the farmers in Kansas, he got no thanks from locals because the pro-slavery faction had every right to get way more unruly. Eventually, he would find himself raiding Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and also captured by Robert E. Lee. He was put on trial for 7 days after I think there was some sort of captain who had drawn his sword but accidentally picked up a training sword, so when he hacked him in the head, he got hit with a training sword, so he survived and would live to be able to put on trial. From then on, the country was very excited in 1859, and any northerner in the South was suspected to be another John Brown. Don't forget, most of the people in those states at the time were usually confined to their own local community. So when you find someone from the North in, say, Mississippi, people are going to really be suspicious of that person. Also, don't forget, Virginia didn't have that many slaves in the first place, as it was part of the upper region of the South. So the Virginians who were witnessing Brown go through this trial were actually a little more sympathetic to him than one would think. So the Virginia governor, Henry Wise at the time, warned, do not let the crowd be near enough to hear anything he says. Basically, John Brown represented to the South that the North was only waiting for its moment to strike the South, and this only continued to arise suspicions between both pro-slavery and free state factions. After his hanging, the Democratic South didn't trust anyone from the North in general. At that point, the country was getting so charged, kind of like we are in today, that it felt like something was going to have to happen in order to resolve those tensions, and there were plenty of mutterings of civil war. Basically, this made the battle no longer local, but national, on a huge scale. And of course, what we saw after Senator Sumner had written some things about one of his opponents, Sumner was beaten brutally on the floor of Congress, as fully appalling to the Northerners as it was appalling to the Southerners when John Brown killed those people in their sleep. And also when John Brown had raided Harper's Ferry. Anyway, now we get to one of the worst parts. For the North, slavery was mostly out of sight, out of mind, but with the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, that changed everything, or was at least one of the factors that did so. The Dred Scott case changed a lot of things. Dred Scott, slave, has a master. The master and Dred Scott traveled through many free territories. He argued that since he was in free territories, he should not have been a slave there and should be free. However, Scott really had no standing as a slave, even as a citizen, to appear before a court, and they had no reason to listen to him, whether it was justified or not. Not only did it say that, but it said that he was property and not a citizen. And as a result, citizen was very vaguely defined in the Constitution at that point. This is a pretty obvious case of twisting the Constitution into aiding slavery, which the North found really repulsive and blatant. A notable Supreme Court judge was named Roger Taney, and Taney was really a thorn in Abraham Lincoln's side and everyone else's side until he died in the 1860s. Whatever Abraham Lincoln would do and everyone else to try to say that slavery was bad or try to, release some sort of emancipation, Taney was kind of like this background figure that was always kind of lurking and basically would do whatever he could to stop, at least from the Supreme Court side. Now, quickly, we'll kind of talk about Abraham Lincoln and who he was. Lincoln was not really a book-educated person, so the fact that he ended up being a lawyer, and an excellent one at that, who was found to be very persuasive, was really not the most intuitive thing you would think about someone like that, born in the backwoods of Kentucky. So some things about Lincoln that scared the South was that Lincoln thought the will of the people could never be so absolute as to vote some people into slavery and some into freedom. This gives some insight as to why he was so willing to go to war, which is such an extreme for such a strange and small principle, at least back then. Lincoln had argued that the Constitution's intention was to gradually phase out slavery, as it had been done by the North by about 1810 and really by 1830 for sure. So Lincoln and the Republican Party started in 1856 with the Whigs splitting into different factions. I mean, seriously, this was not such a binary good versus evil, slaveholder versus free state. There were lots of different factions in both parties, but more so in the Whig Party, to the point where they would go create the Republican Party. Lincoln had won the election of 1860, really because the Democrats had splintered into different factions. Here's why the fact that the South hated that Lincoln was elected and was so afraid of what he would do to the point where they seceded before he had even gotten into office. You have to remember that back then, civil service was still another 30 years away, and every federal point of office was done so by the president. And that meant from the cabinet to the lowliest postmaster. And that was filled at the discretion of the president according to philosophy and party loyalty. Until 1860, roughly half of those were Southerners. The Supreme Court had 19 of 34 people from the South as slaveholders, and even though Lincoln tried his best to distance himself from the peculiar and absurd character that John Brown was, his identity as Republican was enough to appoint non-slaveholders to power. With that being the case, that means that every federal person and marshal would be instructed to turn a blind eye to slavery if they were given power by Lincoln. And that meant that federal marshals wouldn't actually do anything for the Fugitive Slave Act, thereby turning their back on the South. And furthermore, that meant forts would be these bastions of federal law, and where slaves, if they could escape there, would have refuge. And as strange as this may seem, the South really thought that John Brown was taking the White House, in a similar manner that people think Trump is the next Hitler. And within 23 days of Lincoln's inauguration, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida had state conventions held to debate withdrawal. Texas Governor Sam Houston was able to postpone their withdrawal, but that wouldn't be able to hold them off for forever. And Alabama Governor Moore mobilized the state militia and pressured banks in Alabama to guarantee at least $1 million ready to use for the state and suspending hard cash payments, which were mostly owed to northern banks. This is a serious fracturing of society back then. Another point that differentiates the novel from what we learned in school is that in school we learned that all the states kind of seceded at the same time and they were all part of the Confederacy and everyone had the same aims. Remember, like I told you, the South was divided into multiple parts. So when Virginia, Arkansas, and Missouri called state conventions to secede, they actually said no. Virginia lost 2-1, and North Carolina and Tennessee actually called no convention whatsoever. Now in the case of the southern states that had seceded, the federal places like the Post and places that were undefended were easily consumed by the state and the state powers. However, going to the forts is a completely different manner. Obviously, federal troops were told not to desert and that they should stay stationed there. And the forts were really a touchy point. They represented that if the states really meant secession, they would have to go after the forts. This was a nuance to southern states and created serious trouble in their minds. And even worse, it discredited secession upon onlookers to say that federal forts were still operational in these seceded states. To South Carolina, which was, of course, was still a big state at the time, the most irritating were the 3 forts over there that were in Charleston. One of them, of course, was Fort Sumter. So another contributing factor to the Civil War was the South always hated taxes because their transportation was always by water. Why would you want to upgrade any canals or roads if you can move everything up and down the Mississippi, which was their main avenue of transportation? Because don't forget, the steamboat, which was around in 1810 or so, was a massive transportation invention of the time. These things were huge. They could haul shitloads of cotton for cheap. The railroad was a disruptor, though, because this changed everything with the steamboat. And by 1840, the railroad and steamboat were the main competitors of transportation. Interestingly, in 1857, when the Effie Afton steamboat rammed into a railroad bridge, Abraham Lincoln was the lawyer for the Rock Island Bridge Company, and the steamboat at that point, after that lawsuit, had shifted into a clear silver medal second place. Okay, once again, most of everything I just said was found in this book. It's much better than anything I can do in a video, but if you don't want to read the 500 pages that tell you all about the Civil War and you just want to watch a little video on it, that's what I can do for you. Most of what I said is based on this book because it's an awesome book, and like I said, and it paints the light of the world in the days of the 1860s in a way that I've tried to do, but really the book is so much better than anything I could do. So with that said, we've talked at length about all the factors that led to the Civil War, and if there was going to be a Civil War in the United States today in 2025, do we have any similarities or things that we can compare? Well, we haven't gotten to a John Brown character in our own time, who's kind of seen as the revolutionary killing the enemy, which is really sad. Things aren't so binary the way they were in 1860. Back then, it was literally slave state versus non-slave state, and everything was about that, right? Today, it's Democrat and Republican, but the conflict is different. Today, it's really more about, do we want big government or not big government? Blue states and their people want the government to have as much power as possible because they believe that the government has their best interest in mind. Red states and Republicans have the exact opposite view and say that giving the state as much power as possible always leads to disaster, as it has in communist nations and socialist states, and basically that's the relationship. Do we want to give the government as much power as possible, or do we want to restrict the government to as little power as possible and give the people power? Because you can't have both things. Either the government's going to have all the power or the people are going to have all the power. You can't have the people having power and the government having power. It makes no sense. One of the things that's extremely similar is how loaded the conflict has gotten today. Back then, it was becoming supercharged with slavery and abolitionists in a very similar way to our own country today. Everyone who's a Republican thinks the Democrats are communists being someone who wants the state to have as much power as possible, and Republicans and small government people tend to be very suspicious, like myself, of big government people. However, the Democrats and people that want big government are extremely suspicious as well of people who voted for Donald Trump. They tend to think of it as a moral issue. Oh my God, you voted for Donald Trump? You must be a defective or evil human being. Because everything that the Democrats say today is really based on feeling and based on trying to say nice things, but things that don't really work in actuality. If you look into them with some reason, they generally don't consider any other alternatives and can't usually state the opposing party's philosophy or guiding decision. On the contrary, Republicans tend to be able to at least say what Democrats want and be able to give them their view, but tell them why the Republican view, their view, is superior to a Democrat view. If we look even as recent as 10 years ago, before COVID, you could kind of say things about politics, but it was mostly avoidable for the average Joe Schmo. You could mostly keep, like an ostrich, you could keep your head in the sand and there was no issue, really, and you could get away with it without thinking about it in your daily life. However, this is where the problem comes in, kind of like the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, in my opinion, was very much like COVID. COVID was something that was so in your face, no amount or sticking your head in the sand deep enough would be able to have you ignore COVID, because it became worldwide, and in this country, it took fucking forever to end. The Fugitive Slave Act was all of a sudden in these Northerners' faces, and yes, it probably wasn't on the scale that COVID was, but COVID showed us something. First of all, COVID showed what the world was like now. The government was going to be in your face whether you like it or not, and dictate whether you could go outside or do anything. If you were in a state like California, like I was at the time, you could not go outside without wearing a mask, and you would be shamed by other people for not wearing masks. At the very least, you were getting a lot of looks and attention just by not wearing a mask outside, regardless of your age or how healthy you were. Total fucking bullshit. The gymnastics that we went through in California were ridiculous. Before COVID, you could mostly ignore the government, but after COVID, you could not, especially in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, you were not allowed to go outside. You couldn't have contact with people generally. I mean, I even had my neighbor flip out on me, who I'd known for years, and she said I was being irresponsible and started yelling at me the second I walked by her. And all I did was say hi. Apparently, breathing in her direction outside was enough for her to constitute yelling at someone she had known. She showed me her true colors, and it's not forgettable, especially when her son and I were reasonably good friends. And this was not an isolated case. This happened in a lot of places. There was a restaurant reasonably close to my parents' house, and you couldn't have people go inside and sit down. You couldn't have people go in the patio outside where it was nice and sit down. But what you could do is go to the curb. You could put these giant orange construction barriers, and then you could put tables and chairs there. So because you're outside on this curb, you can't get COVID. But when you go in the patio, all of a sudden COVID is spreading like crazy. What kind of fucking world were we living in? So like I said, to someone who didn't pay attention to politics or any of that bullshit before, now it was in your face, and the stupidity was unavoidable. People were wearing masks in their car. We all remember the ridiculousness of it, right? Kamala saying, I wouldn't get the jab if I tried. It was under Trump. They switched their tune real quick, and forever, it was all about you must get vaccinated. My brother had to get vaccinated because my brother was trying to work in Los Angeles at the time too. He had to get vaccinated in order to work, and you had to show your vax card or whatever that bullshit was, right? This was a 2-year period. It was just an unbelievable amount of stupidity, and it was unavoidable and unforgettable. Supply chains broke down as well, so you saw who people really were, and yes, there was a lot of toilet paper consumed in the process. So after COVID, we had this moment in this country where it's become very politically charged, and it's very similar to the pre-Civil War. Now, we aren't at a point like 1859 where John Brown was executed, with Trump being way more of a controversial figure than Abraham Lincoln was to the South. And even though Abraham Abraham Lincoln was a very controversial figure to the people in the South because they thought John Brown was taking the White House, it's not that dissimilar from Trump taking the office. For a second time, the Democrats thinking all the Republican people are fucking stupid and thinking that they voted for a Nazi a second term, and now there's a Nazi in the White House again. That's what they literally think. And when they find all this corruption and all this massive inefficiency and waste, the Democrats do not clap, sitting there as though they represent inefficiency and waste. It's unbelievable what we saw last night on the address to Congress. Anyway, I would just say that we're in a very close point to where, as Frederick Douglass had put in this book later on, that really we're getting to a point where I just don't see how this could be resolved without conflict. Things have gotten so polarized. People think the government must have control. They must control everything. The government will fight for me. There's no way a person could do it. I will not take responsibility for my life. I must not be responsible for the decisions in my life as an autonomous figure. I must have the government do it or someone else do the decisions for me. And therefore, you're a demon for advocating that you think you can do it by yourself. Whereas on the opposite side with the Republicans, I just want to be free. I want to make my decisions on my own. The government should not have this power. It's not allowed in the Constitution. Many of the governments overstep their boundaries all the time. The courts are very slow to punish this kind of stuff. We saw a lot of overstepping during COVID, and we want to pay way less in taxes because our taxes are going to ridiculous things anyway. So why the fuck are we paying 20 to 30%? And really, that's only taxes because after inflation's accounted for, we're getting absolutely fucking screwed here. I'm going to the grocery store and it's costing 20 to 50 bucks every time just to pick up a few things that would have costed 20 to 30 or 40 bucks 10 years ago maybe. As Trump said, the economy's gotten way out of hand and he's inherited a disaster, and unfortunately you can't just duct tape that overnight. So at this point it feels like it's going to be your conservative nationalist USA Americans versus these communist wannabe types who unfortunately have been amassed into the mass hypnosis of the mass state. Of course, Leviathan and His Enemies is a great book that talks all about that, but it's really going to be about mass state and mass corporations versus the small guy trying to make his own decisions and live his small life, happily without interference. When we talk about John Brown as well, taking up the White House in the figure of Lincoln as the South saw it, it's very similar because we all know that Trump is no Nazi. And in fact, Trump has done so much for this country already, which we've been asking for decades, which was ignored by Bush, who was terrible, Obama, who was almost even worse, and Biden, which are like almost like the three crooks. Whereas first term Trump wasn't great, but this second term Trump is really going headbutting and charging right into the battle, trying to get rid of all this shit. And we finally got rid of the border problem. Not only were we this close to losing the entire country just to Democrat rule from all the illegal immigrants, just by default, by sheer numbers of votes. Like Elon said, if we stop giving out these massive amounts of free shit in California, which I know they do all the time there, we stop the incentive of people trying to come into the country and getting more money here for free than they would in their own country if they were. If we dry up the well, people will stop coming. And if we dry up the well, that means I'm not paying as much taxes that are getting thrown into other people. This is how empires fall apart. So we're at a moment here that's very close to crisis, and I just don't see how this could end without civil war or some sort of massive conflict that we get entangled in, kind of like World War II. Or of course they had the Great Depression, but they went to go fight these external wars. So how does maybe we do ride off into the sunset and we have 25 years in a row of great presidents who slowly back us down from overspend, no more war, reducing taxes, firing IRS employees, stopping spending, and putting money in the right places to the point where for the people who are paying taxes to actually get those benefits. So if that happens for the next if that happens for the next 6 elections, maybe we do back out of this without a conflict and, we slowly get back to reality and education stops being ridiculous because the schools don't teach us shit anyway. Most of the shit I was pleasantly surprised in a book I found. Rather than spend tens of thousands of dollars in schools, why don't we just go buy books and read on our own? Of course, that takes a huge amount of self-discipline to kind of sacrifice that, and it would probably never work, but compulsory education is certainly no good. I'm sure if we had communities where people gathered around and went to, the first Monday of this month will be this dad teaching or something like that, and then the second Tuesday will be this dad teaching, and they kind of had everyone pitch in kind of like that, I'm sure that kids would be much better off, rather than this mass education bureaucracy horseshit that doesn't teach us anything in the first place. So another thing I want to mention here with the parallels of our own time is something that's kind of mentioned in the book, but it's really more of a theme throughout all of history. We will easily label things we do not understand as irrational if we're unable to ingeniously decipher something. Our ingenious is limited rather than any supposed irrationality of any other time in what we are studying in the past for a reason. It should come as a practical and fundamental warning. Do not impute irrationality to people of history too quickly. They're trying their best in the time. It's not like anyone's actually sitting there trying to be as evil as possible. Sometimes it does happen. I mean, look how long it took us to even get to farming in the span of Homo sapien, let alone getting rid of slavery in just some parts of the world. It took us a long time to get that far. So we're very slow. And yes, there's a lot of people who are evil and try to backtrack us. But at the same time, a lot of the time, there's just the common guy trying to do his best, trying to get by with the constraints of the time he had. The internet has done so many good things because it brings so much power to the average person because they have so much access to information. They just have to have the drive to ask the right questions, and they'll find the right answers about a lot of stuff. Not everything, but about a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, Google has made it much harder to find things in the last 8 years, so it might be a little harder today. But for the most part, the internet represents something phenomenal. And look at our illiteracy. We don't have rampant illiteracy like we used to. So with the internet and the advent of technology and how easy it is to get around state to state, rather than the horse and carriage days of the Civil War and before that, there is still the sentiment of statehood and such. Now, the loyalty to statehood is very different than it was back then. It's really not the way it was. We have the option to spend most of our lives in other states if we so choose. Back then, you were pretty much in your own community. So the thing that hasn't changed between those two times is similar to the way that people in Boston thought that James Madison was being a douchebag in 1812 when he declared war and the Bostonians got hammered by some Virginian's decision. Today, we have a similar thing. Whether you're in Texas, California, or another state, and you think that some decisions have been horribly made by those in Washington, D.C., why the fuck am I going to have to suffer and pay the bill for others when someone else in Washington is basically going to use my money, which I've worked hard for, to go spend it on some horseshit that doesn't even meet the basic necessity of justification? It's complete and total bullshit. So that in itself hasn't changed, and that's still a huge thing we face and probably will always face as human beings. Why should someone else be able to allocate resources that I've worked hard for, especially if it doesn't even go to my own benefit? If it goes to my benefit in an inefficient manner, that's one thing. If it goes to my benefit in an efficient manner, that's an even another thing. But if I don't even get to see any of my own benefit, then what the fuck am I paying this for? I need to get something out of it. Now we're going to look at some of the fighting between the North and South. What we're going to find out is that the South was ill prepared. What we're going to find out, because of the South's agrarian nature and that they didn't invest in manufacturing whatsoever, the North had huge advantages. They had way more railroad technology, which meant that they could move the shitloads of stuff for all the armies where it needed to go, whereas the South had really limited capability on that, especially with their crappy built railroads. And when we look at today, who has all the power? The conflict is not so much North and South today, as much as it is big city and Democrats versus the rural Republican culture. Where does most of the big city food come from? It's probably not the big city. I can tell you in this big city apartment I live in, there are no plants outside from which I can draw vegetation. If there was a war and food importing to cities was restricted, I could tell you that the big city people would suffer. Now, I don't even know what this war would look like because it's ridiculous. It's very hard to conceive that a city would face the rural parts of the country because that's kind of what the voting representation is right now. But the big city is going to go conquer the rural areas. It's very hard to imagine this. But should something like that happen, well, all the food comes from outside the city, so the cities would suffer massively if food mobility was restricted or the rural areas chose to stop distributing food out to the cities. Okay, and now we're going to continue on into the fighting. I'm not so interested in the fighting as much as I am about the prelude to the conflict and what it looks like compared to our own timeline, but it's still worth mentioning some things here so that we could see the brutality with which America engaged in with each other. And even though there was about 600,000 deaths or so, it was really probably more like 700,000 just because of record keeping being so poor back then. So losing New Orleans in 1862 was a huge, massive loss to the South. This was you have to remember that New Orleans at the time was a huge financial shipping center for the South. This is one of the main avenues of how they got all their shitloads of cotton out and made a lot of their money. We have to also remember the banking system of the time. Remember, Jackson was very anti-bank of the United States. And for that reason, I think he's one of the best presidents we've had. I think that once you start printing shitloads of money and you start inflating the fuck out of it, the consumer and the small guy lose entirely. I mean, look what's happening with our dollar today. So with that said, this hampered the government into a small fiscally weak state rather than this giant gargantuan central bank kind of government that Nicholas Biddle went to war with Andrew Jackson over in the 40s of the 1800s. So the North was basically the South's broker, and now they had all these banknotes and IOUs. And once you go to war with the North, why would you pay them back? So now Northern bankers started flocking to Lincoln to try to provoke him to go to war so they could get their money back. And the question would come up, how did the government pay for the war? Well, the South inflated the shit out of their currency, but the North invented the greenback, and even though the inflation was 80%, it was nowhere near as bad as the South. Now, that's a problem we have today. Think about the wars that we've had recently. We went to the Iraq-Afghanistan debacle, the forever wars that never seem to end, and we put it on the national debt credit card, and it's been a huge problem ever since. So when you have these governments that are infinitely trying to print money, they have no reason to stop these wars. Like I said, there were a few forts in South Carolina. Fort Moultrie was one of them, and the other two were Castle Pinckney, which was apparently obsolete, kind of like an American Revolution time sort of fort and very outdated. And then Fort Sumter, the one that we all know that South Carolina ended up attacking. And Fort Sumter was right in the heart of Charleston and was like an incomplete brick pentagon. Major Robert Anderson's orders were to continue business as usual unless he felt threatened and avoid provocation. So with Fort Sumter really being the eye of the prize of the three forts, on January 9th they attempted to resupply on a transport with provisions and reinforcements, and it was fired upon on the South Carolina militia and forced to withdraw, so it never made it there. Major Anderson had about 85 people and there were 60 cannons. They were as close to wartime ready as possible, but because this occurred in January, this allowed Buchanan to leave office and save face, allowing the next administration to deal with this horrible problem. Sumter had been cut off from supplies like food and mail, and they only had 6 weeks of reserve. So, given that this was around mid-January, they had about 6 weeks to make a decision by March 1st. For 3 weeks, Lincoln weighed his options. Resupply would obviously be fired upon again, and that could cause a full-out war. And remember, not all of the states had seceded yet. That could cause Kentucky and New Maryland to go from not seceding, even though they were slave states, into secession if something could happen. So it was the best interest of Lincoln to not provoke anything. Lincoln weighed his options and then decided to send in a flotilla. Davis and the Confederacy had learned about his plans. On April 11th, they ordered to fire on Fort Sumter before the flotilla could arrive, and the battle ensued. They started firing upon it, and for 34 hours the siege took place. And somehow, after Anderson waved the white flag, nobody had actually died. Now, Fort Sumter is a pretty brazen move for the South to make. They were serious about secession and keeping it that way. So at the time, Lincoln only had 15,000 troops for Union forces, which is a paltry amount. So he had to use the Militia Act of 1795 in order to bring up any sort of army. This allowed him to bring up 75,000 troops in total. Legally, he couldn't raise an army outside of Congress in session. You could either go into the U.S. Army or go into your state regiment army and volunteer under the state flag. Of course, remember, state loyalties were different back then, and you could serve for 2 or 3 years in most cases. The state officers were behaved little better than a mob of hunters at a turkey shoot, and the uniforms were hardly uniforms. And the 2-year veterans that did have experience showed no enthusiasm at the end to re-enlist. In the South, especially the Upper South region, they were very unwilling to go to war when led by the bold South Carolinian hotheads. Virginia was unwilling to fight the Union on South Carolina's behalf, because remember, states were very different, but they also didn't want to join the Union in suppressing the rest of the South. And given that Virginia refused Lincoln, the state seized the Norfolk Yard after 2 state conventions. So shit's starting to hit the fan. So before we get into the real meat and potatoes of the fighting, there are some things that have to be said about the experience of the common soldier in both the South and the North. Remember, they're not like us today where they have Call of Duty and they can play for hours and hours. And even though Call of Duty is really unrealistic, obviously, it at least gives us a better idea of how battle works than someone who's on a farm their whole life and suddenly has to pick up a gun. Remember, they only had 15,000 troops in the North, so they're going to have to make this massive army. The American Revolution was fought with very few troops, but this war is going to be fought with these massive giant armies, kind of similar to how Europe had started changing that trend, to where there were these tens of thousands of troops all fighting in line in session with each other. So given that the troops were so inexperienced and had really no idea what they were doing in battle, both armies thought it would be better to fight a defensive war and make it more difficult than it was worth and try to bankrupt the enemy than to try and wage an offensive war with a bunch of recruits and novices. Remember, offense requires a lot of coordination and mobility, and you have to really fight in tune with each other. So that's not really the case when you have these ragtag farmers again. Under George Washington, army sizes of 5,000 to 6,000 troops was common, but with Napoleon's European campaigns, that number went way up to 80,000 or even 100,000 sometimes. This is not a time when you have airplanes and military trucks that you can just stockpile people with food. Trying to feed these massive fucking armies is, in those days, an impossible task. Remember, the main method of transportation is like horse and wagon, and you can't just have a horse pull a shitload of food like that for that massive amount of army, right? So at that point, whoever had the railroad advantage was really going to be able to feed their own army, right? While railroads made it possible to at least accumulate massive armies, it also made it kind of like a leash that if you went too far away, you would screw yourself and starve your army to death, or at least partially. As I'd mentioned earlier, the South only had a quarter of the railroad that the North had, and also the South's railroad quality was way worse than the North. The North was much more industrial. They could make all the engines, locomotives, and the iron that you actually need for rail. The South had none of these capabilities. Most of the rail and locomotives themselves were built in the North and made and transported to the South in some capacity. They were built and manufactured by northern factories. So the South really had no capability of keeping up with this railroad and trying to feed its army. So the South's biggest problem was not having railroad to transport their stuff. And for the railroads they did have, it really could not transport things very quickly because the rail they had was not that solid. It was only supposed to be hauling around cotton, not shitloads of equipment and food necessary for these massive armies. And furthermore, the South never had to really build east-west lines because all the rail was supposed to do was get the cotton from one city and put it to the coastline, so it really had north-south most of the time. It wasn't necessary to go from New Orleans to Charleston and build an east-west line because the nearest coast was closer to New Orleans in New Orleans. To put it in perspective, the South only had 2 east-west Union railroad lines, and the Union got to them by 1862, so going east-west was useless to them. They had no capability of of going east-west by the time of 1862, and that was a real detriment to their army capabilities. And by 1863, wartime use of the railroad was beating the shit out of the rail they already had laid down, and since all available iron that they could make was going towards weapons, they had no way to repair a rail that they were already just trying to destroy with their heavy usage. Remember, we think of rail today as kind of easy because it's been built so well today, but you have to remember back then, rail was still experimental and in this new phase, so it's not like they were built really, really solid. These locomotives were not going 100 miles an hour, the way you can kind of haul ass on an Amtrak or the California Zephyr line. These railroads were not, they were going like, what, 20, maybe 30 miles an hour? I mean, remember in Back to the Future, trying to get that rail thing to go 88 miles an hour, that was a big deal. So at the time of Fort Sumter being fired upon, Lincoln had no general of staff to coordinate functions, whether it came to recruitment, training, or even map making. Because remember, there's no Google Maps. A lot of these regions are poorly mapped, and you need to go to locals to find the actual maps of how to get around places. Lincoln, he had no heavy cavalry and only had skirmish cavalry, and hardly had any artillery at the end of the Mexican War. Now, a bigger problem in comparison to the European landscape and the American landscape was that when we look at the European British Army and the French Army, these are really strong armies, especially after Napoleon days, right? These two armies are massive, monster, professional armies, and compared to the American armies are totally pathetic. When we look at these professional tactical books or strategy books, most of them are going to talk about in fighting in the open plains of Europe. That does not exist in America, and especially not in the East Coast region. There are shitloads of heavily wooded forests, and this open battle type of thing that they do in Europe is really not applicable in 1860 in the United States because of how heavily wooded it is. When we look at Lincoln also trying to emancipate the slaves, and Lincoln had promised not to touch slavery by the time it was 1860 in his election. Even though he hated slavery, he wasn't going to touch it to try and preserve the Union, and the South still seceded. The reason he didn't want to touch slavery by the time they fired at Fort Sumter is because there were still 4 slave states who had not seceded with the South. Those were Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. Pissing them off and having them join the South would be a real big mistake. So he waited until 1863 to emancipate the slaves. This is another thing when you talk about it in school, you probably skim over it in one sentence, but the book does such a fantastic job of trying to demonstrate where these alliances and why there's hesitation and what people did. It seems irrational to us, like I've discussed, when we look at it in school because they just go over it in one sentence. But when you kind of paint this picture of the world in 1860, it makes a lot more sense. Now, of course, the Civil War was fought over 2 big things. One was the preservation of the Union, and the second was, of course, slavery. So when black troops in the North who were free tried to enlist, the North actually turned them away. So we have to remember, too, that this is the world of 1860, and even though tons of blacks are still enslaved in the South, that doesn't mean that everything is just hunky-dory in the North. Whites and blacks are not cohabitating in the same kind of non-segregated world that we think they might be. Whites still have lots of reservations about blacks in the North. They just don't enslave them. There's a massive difference between this. Only after 1863, with the emancipation, did blacks finally start to be accepted into the army. And of course, blacks are more than happy to join the North. In the blacks' minds in 1863, if they can fight side by side with the Union troops, that could give them cause to be a citizen and get voting rights, which would be for them like a huge victory because they've been fucked the whole time they've been in the United States. Like I mentioned earlier, the professional armies of Britain and France were way more experienced than the farmers and the ragtag novices and recruits that the United States would get into battle. Once the war was over, most of these people were expecting to go back to their livelihoods, unlike the British and French super military agents who were professionals. Now, many people in the South were not actually pro-slavery. In the case of the small farmer, who had very few slaves or none at all, they didn't really have a reason to fight for slavery, but because they had people in their community going to war, they also chose to go to war themselves, even though they didn't really agree with the precipice of slavery necessarily. When we look at the North and why they chose to go to war, keeping the Union together was such a massively important thing at the time. We have to remember that looking at the European monarchies as the dominant power force, and America being this weird constitutional republic as almost an outsider, it was way more important for the North to prove itself and prove the United States could stay together as a unified country and constitutional republic rather than this shattered experiment that the constitutional republic would be an inevitable fractured country that wasn't possible. And for all intents and purposes, the North fighting to keep the Union together, there was way more at stake with that than people would first realize. At first, they were not interested in slavery being the main reason to go to war. Preserving the Union was very important back then, and more important than we probably understand today, because we can't relate to a country that was never unified. The 50th state we put into the Union at this point was in 1959, and that was Hawaii. That is 40 years before I was born, and so almost nobody can remember a time when Hawaii wasn't a state. We can't relate to a country that ever was accumulating states. It's not relatable, but back then it was a very valid point. However, as the war went on and the North came in closer and closer contact with the everyday brutalities of slavery when they entered the South, because remember, the North people didn't go to the South generally, and the brutal realities of slavery became commonplace and apparent, abolition started to only then be a little bit more of a motivation devastation rather than just upholding the Union. And to give you a little bit of an idea of how big the scale of this country was with its new enlistees, 2.1 million men started serving for the North and included 33% of all military-age males, while the Confederates had just under a million, I think 960,000 or something like this, and that was about 80% of their population of military-age men. Also, speaking of the experience of both armies, the U.S. had very few people with Mexican-American War experience, and therefore the majority of young people had never encountered the brutalities of war before. Hence why, even though Call of Duty's total bullshit, we at least have an idea of what it might look like and we only have the tiniest scale on imagination of how bad war might look. They had no Call of Duty, so they had zero conception about it. Across the board, it seemed like volunteers would not take drill and regimen very seriously. Even though the North had a bunch of undisciplined soldiers who were not willing to learn too much, the South had it worse because with slavery in their culture, they were used to blacks doing all the things for soldiers that now soldiers were responsible for. And how can your ego stay intact if you're all of a sudden washing the dishes or cleaning something when you're used to a black guy who's beneath you doing that all the time for you? So everything could be peaceful and hunky-dory during peacetime, but once the shots started being fired, it became total helter-skelter, and units usually fell apart as lack of discipline kicked in. Needless to say, stuff like target practice was hardly a thing at this time, and training was so bad that people in the rear could actually kill people in the front. Now, to put in perspective how each army was composed, the Union had about 80% infantry, 14% cavalry, and 6% artillery, whereas the Confederates had 75% infantry, 20% cavalry, and 5% artillery. Equipment-wise, federal arsenals could supply 700,000 Springfield rifles during the war, Springfield, Massachusetts being the place where this was made, and private arms makers could supply about 450,000 arms on the side. The South had 400,000 Enfields run through Union naval blockades and had no access to Springfields beyond what they could scavenge on the battlefield. So, given with how untrained these soldiers were and how ill-equipped they were, even though we look at movies and such where soldiers are always firing and there's lots of gunfire, realistically, with these untrained soldiers and how unprepared each soldier was, you could probably fire one shot every 4 to 5 minutes, I would say on average, which is a completely and totally pathetic rate of fire. But remember, this is not just like an automatic clip. You are taking a one-shot rifle and you are trying to ramrod that fucking thing, and you got to clean it out, and you have to do this. There were like 9 steps to it, and when you compare it to today's gun is just like so much different. It's not even funny. So in addition to how badly prepared each soldier was with their training or lack thereof, riflemen had to actually be carefully trained to aim above their targets, and they had back sights fitted to encourage the shooter to shoot up. Remember, these rifles are not super high power guns like we might have today. They still fire, but the bullet velocity is not going to be as high, right? So that means if it's not firing as fast, it's only going to go straight so far before it starts dropping off, right? So that distance is vastly different than ones we have today. For fun, I had Grok tell me about the bullet drop off, and it seems to agree with the same thing. Muzzle velocities are pretty low. 900 to 1200 feet is not that fast. The drop at 100 yards is 10 to 12 inches. That means you have to aim a foot above your person at 100 yards. That's fucking ridiculous. 50 to 60 inches at 200 yards is nuts as well. That means you're aiming 5 feet into the air hoping that it hits the person. And you think that a recruit is going to be able to hit you with this? This is just, this whole war was just kind of a giant shit show in some respects. If you're aiming at anything that's 500 yards over, that's 2 to 3 times modern stuff. You have to basically aim at something like you're out lobbing an artillery shell, which is just nuts. So most of these battles are actually a lot closer range than you would think. As I said, there's about 1 in 20 artillery pieces in this war. So for every 20 soldiers, there's about 1 artillery soldier ready to go. And the loading sequence was already hard enough for infantry. But when we look at the artillery pieces, they were way, way more complex. Now, the Union had the obvious edge in artillery manufacturing because they had all the factories, and it's not even close. Now, one of the main differences is the South actually had a huge advantage in cavalry because of their mainly agrarian or rural lifestyle. That meant horses were more commonplace, and people had more horse riding experience than those in the North did. So go figure, one of the all-star commanders of the South, Nathan Bedford Forrest, had a fearsome cavalry unit who reaped havoc on the North the entire time in the war. But again, even with the cavalry, it was also very expensive to mass produce the amount of food needed and also produce the horse mounts that were needed to ride them. So the South had to be cautious and restrict its size. Horses specifically had about 8 months to live on average, and they needed 7,000 horses separately and 14,000 mules just to keep them mobile. Civil War cavalrymen had very little training, and the maneuvers were so complex that when mounted, they actually didn't end up being that useful given how undertrained they were. So before the Civil War, since cavalry were already so expensive, Congress had no interest in expanding a very expensive unit of the military, especially when the terrain was so restricted with these huge forests, and you can't just do huge charging maneuvers like you could in Europe across the open plains over there. So continuing on the adventurous experience of the soldier in the Civil War, in camps on both sides, prostitution, drunkenness, gambling, and thievery were both pretty commonplace. And as the war went on, the average infantryman actually started to recognize that the guy on the other side, whether it was Yankee looking at a Confederate or Confederate looking at a Yankee, that the other guy is not all that different from me. They had common religions, tended to like the same music, and were democratic of some sort in politics. The real killer of the war was disease. For every soldier that died in battle, 2 2 died of disease. You have to remember that this is at a time when that understanding what germs were was non-existent, and this was really kind of almost like the end of the medieval era in terms of science and understanding disease. The North lost 10% of their folk to disease, and the South lost 20. Now, I want you to envision the living conditions of a camp in the Civil War at that time, and probably how unsanitary it is, especially with people who don't understand even the value of washing your hands or bathing. So, when you add up all the disease and disgusting shit that was probably going on, water contamination, garbage piles that attracted flies and rodents, and the army medical teams were really not much help. One of the main methods of treating wounded soldiers was amputation. Kill it before gangrene gets them. For the most part, medical practice was useless and non-existent in that time, and that's just the sad reality. So in these camps, beside them being absolutely disgusting in prostitution and drunkenness, the camps saw the social roles completely change as well. What was common for women, right, sewing, cooking, and cleaning were borderline impossible for these men to all of a sudden flip in their heads and finding themselves doing these tasks happily even if their lives depended on it, because that's not the role of what a man was back home. But now in the army, they have to do this shit. Funnily enough, there was also an opioid epidemic, because when people are in severe and extreme pain, they just had opioids, and all of a sudden you just give it to all these people who are in pain, and that starts a real sad addiction. The soldiers' diet too was also fucking terrible. They didn't have MREs at the time, obviously, so they got a nice rock hard piece of bread, usually a fourth of a pound of fresh meat, fresh I say, maybe a little sugar, coffee, salt, and that was for the North. For the Confederates, the food was even worse. The blockades and horrible transportation and non-usage of railroads in the South meant that they frequently went hungry. We have to remember that you didn't just have a refrigerator back then, and you couldn't just open the fridge, and these train cars weren't really refrigerated either. So if you didn't get that food out and going and transport it very fast, you were going to let it spoil, and you can eat it if you want. You're just going to get sick as hell. So serious and mortal wounds were oftentimes fatal because of the lack of medicine and surgery that really didn't exist back then. Amputation was the only valid method, and of course, those medical surgeons were really more like butchers at the time. Soldiers that were wounded always tore the cloth away to see how badly they were wounded. They wanted to know if they were going to live or they were going to die. They had already seen hundreds of soldiers that had been wounded, and they knew what type of wounds. They knew which ones died and which ones didn't, so by looking at their own wound, they would probably be able to assess if they would die or not reasonably accurately, just based on the experience of looking at other soldiers. About 200,000 federal soldiers, which is about 12%, deserted, and the South had 104,000, which is about 16% of their force. Of the 80,000 arrested Union soldiers, only 147 ever appeared to have any sort of traditional punishment, such as hanging or squad firing. So, soldiers who were scared often relied on alcohol to fuel them with courage. Now we get to one of the fun points of the war, which is the international aspect. We have to remember that the South was in major cahoots with Britain because Britain had such a cotton-starved textile industry that without cotton, Britain was going to face some serious economic problems, and the South was hoping to use that to their advantage, to try to get the British to fight off the Union blockade. So, as much as 25% of the British workforce in total was connected to the southern cotton export. 25%! And as much as 50% of all exports of British goods had some sort of cotton in them. This meant that British national interests were at stake, and this could provoke them to attack the North. So, the South was heavily relying on Britain and France to come to the rescue. Really more Britain than France, but of course, France nonetheless. Now, of course, international law was still kind of in its infancy in those days compared to today, but Lincoln was very careful to never mention the South as a separate country, and he always talked about them as a rebellion or insurrection that was a little too powerful to suppress. If he mentioned them as a separate country, this could give Britain and France ideas about intervening on behalf of another country. The U.S. Navy blockaded 3,550 miles of the South in the 9 major ports of Charleston, Wilmington, Mobile, Galveston, New Orleans, Savannah, Pensacola, Norfolk, and Jacksonville. And those were the big hitters of the South. Funnily enough, the North only had 42 ships, and 24 of which were modern and steam-powered, and only 3 were actually ready to go for northern blockade duty. Now, the speed of the Northern Navy at which they deployed against the South was devastating to the South, mostly. But you also have to remember what's going to happen with international ships. As untrained as the soldiers were in the Union Army, the Navy soldiers were just as inexperienced. There could be explosive situations which could result the Union Navy accidentally fires or raids an international ship. So Britain had declared neutral. There was a ship called the Trent. The British had declared as neutral, and the Trent was going on its way back to Britain out of somewhere south of the United States, and the Union Navy actually fired upon it and raided it and kidnapped 4 passengers, which really pissed off Britain. Let's not forget that Britain was still present in Canada, which was their neighbors. In spite of this, Canada actually started raising an army to get ready to intervene on the Union. Now, eventually it all kind of worked out for the Union because they were able to send the kidnapped passengers back to Britain, which were, I think, diplomats, but the Canadian troops were ready to go. And the British had 35,000 regulars on the way through the Atlantic. That was about as close as it got during the war for another country to intervene on the South's behalf. With no way to manufacture Navy ships for the South, they had to get creative. So what they did is they tried to buy things from France and Britain. Britain was very strict about not outfitting them for war purposes because they didn't want to get dragged into a war that they didn't sign up by arming the enemy of another country. But realistically, the proof was easy to evade, and the government of Britain was inefficient when combating them. They really just had it there as a formality, with no intention behind it. So, by the fall of 1862, you, this is as close as the South is ever going to have anyone come on their behalf. After the Trent Affair, the effects of the cotton blockade, which started starving Britain, and they had some monster job losses in Britain, of course, due to the lack of cotton, and some of the upsets that General Lee was inflicting upon the Union, it was easy to say that they almost got help from Britain. What they could not have anticipated was that Britain was pretty quick, was that even though Britain took a heavy hit from the lack of cotton, they were able to change their cotton manufacturers to countries like Brazil, India, and Egypt. Once this remedy was found, it was no longer necessary for the British to give a shit about the cotton problem of the South, since they solved it themselves. And remember, Britain knew pretty well that the Americans are not fun to fight because they're 3,000 fucking miles away. You think trying to invade the North and South is already hard enough on American soil. Trying to fight an enemy 3,000 miles away is not a winning proposition. So with that being the case, the best way the Confederates could deal with the Union blockade was, well, evading it. Remember, the North didn't actually have that many ships, so the South started having blockade runners. As far as we know, about 9 out of 10 blockade runners would actually get by the Union with no problem and make it back. Here's the thing. While the blockade runners were a massive success, they didn't make that much money in comparison to what the illusion of the Union Navy did to other countries and deterred them from trading with the South because of the Union blockade being there. So even though these blockade runners were massively successful, they didn't make up nearly enough money for the deficit that the South was now having because of the Union blockade. Overall, the South exported as much as 50 times as much cotton in 1860 as it was able to pass through the blockade in all 4 years of the Civil War. So basically that's like 2%. They were able to get 2% of cotton that they were able to get through in 1 year in all 4 years. So they got absolutely screwed by the Union blockade. The blockade was also a massive drain on the Confederates and their economy. Costs in the Confederacy absolutely skyrocketed, and the currency and the morale fell in the South generally. When we look at the North and their setup for success, we see that Edwin Stanton was one of the most fantastic people Lincoln could have had under him. The South and the North almost had opposite governments in this time of war, because the North had excellent coordination with terrible generals until Grant came along, and the South had terrible coordination with excellent generals. And of course, once Stonewall Jackson was killed, that started the downhill for many of the Southern forces. So Edwin Stanton was a fantastic person for Lincoln to have, and also a gentleman named Montgomery Meigs. Meigs supplied the Federals with uniforms, tents, ambulances, ambulance wagons, supply wagons, mules, cavalry, transportation, transport horse, and the forage to feed them. Uniforms could be worn out as soon as 3 months, and shoes were a huge obstacle. The army was consuming about 25,000 pairs of shoes a week. Remember, these are not the best made quality things of all time back then. Now, something that is so fucking fascinating about back then is that despite the gargantuan size of this Union army and the never-ending demands, a congressional audit could not find a single penny unaccounted for in any contract authorized by Montgomery Meigs. We do not have that luxury going on today. The U.S. government and the Pentagon and whatever other industries cannot pass a fucking audit for their goddamn lives. We know that it's all corrupt and that money's getting stolen. It's been like this for years, but only now with Donald Trump in office is it finally starting to get the light shown on it that it needs. Now, like I said, clothes and equipment were challenging, but feeding the army was another thing altogether. Do not forget, refrigeration and food preservation wasn't a thing. So even if the food was absolute dog shit quality for the Union, it was better in the South, and they rarely lacked the sufficient quantities thanks to General Taylor, and the same could not even be close in the South. Also, the Chief of Ordnance Ripley was able to keep their ammunition sufficiently supplied. At the beginning of the war, the Union only had 437,000 rifles, 40,000 of which were from any recent vintage, and the two armories of Harper's Ferry and Springfield, Massachusetts could only manufacture 3,000 to 4,000 a month. Now, Harper's Ferry obviously fell in Virginia very early in the war, so Ripley was able to acquire 727,000 of those arms from other countries. And also there was some big new contractors coming in. Remington, New Haven Arms, which was Winchester, Smith & Wesson, and Sam Colt. Ripley also expanded the Springfield Armory to 300,000 weapons a year. That is 6 times bigger than anything they could have seen at the beginning of the war. And he enlarged 9 other facilities as well. By the end of 1862, they didn't even need foreign imports anymore, because by 1863 they were actually getting a surplus of rifles. Now, this is all useless if you don't have great coordination of getting this all to troops, but Stanton and the usage of the railroad were basically flawless. The North had 22,000 miles of rail and the South had 9,000 by comparison, and it only cost 10% of what a horse and wagon would have cost. And this was one of the biggest things that the book brought attention to that I think that we should highlight. The congressional powers authorized the North to steal railroads and kind of militarize them and make sure that whoever was in charge of the railroads got no compensation because of military power. What Stanton and the Lincoln administration chose to do was to still strike a bargain and a deal with the railroad owners and pay them for using it, rather than what the South did. The South was authoritarian and militarized the railroad randomly whenever they wanted to because they were so desperate. So thanks to the efforts of those men, which cannot be understated, the Union, in a time when airplanes and cell phones did not really exist and the telegram was only starting to be useful then, the Union army was more than adequately supplied. Very different experience than the South. Now, the Confederates had 159,000 rifles on hand, and many of them were obsolete. Don't forget, like I told you, with that huge drop-off, a lot of these rifles sucked even even more than the modern ones back then, at least by comparison to today's modern standard. The Confederacy had only 11% of the industrial capacity that the North had. They had Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia, Shelby Iron Works, and Briarfield Furnace in northern Alabama, and Selma, Alabama in 1861. The South, however, had supreme agricultural resources. However, one of the big problems was many of the grain producing and meat growing areas were in the upper South, which the Union captured early on in the war and screwed the South later on. By comparison, the South was completely and totally out-railroaded. The two east-west systems, like I said, were cut off in 1862, that's pretty early on in the war, and the southern railroads were not really used for heavy industry, it was for cotton hauling. And they had been allowed to make with shitty track quality, because what else would you need them for? Nobody had planned on this war, and because everything was going towards weapons, any rail that got chewed up, there was really no way to repair them because they had no way to make iron. So Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and he had some serious problem finding subordinates, like the equivalent Stanton and Meigs in the Union. Davis had 4 secretaries of war, and the South, rather than supplying the uniforms, which was already very difficult to do for the North, gave the Southern soldiers a $21 uniform allowance, and obviously the soldiers spent it on other stuff. Remember all the stimulus checks? How much of that do you think actually went to people's rent? Until 1862, the Southern troops were adequately fed, but once they lost control of the wheat and meat producing areas of the Upper South, the shortages started to really hit them. Now, one of the most authoritarian things that the South did was the 1863 Impressment Act. This authorized the agents to seize food supplies when farmers refused to sell them at the government dogshit rates. So basically, the Southern government could come in there, kick your door down, force you to give them all the food that they need at the crappy government rate, say that you're compensated, and then move along. So if you're a common farmer and somehow you're not being drafted into the war, and you really don't want to have anything to do with slavery, now this pro-slave government's coming in and knocking down your door. Not a great formula for success. Another thing too is they didn't necessarily lack all the food. This is a very agrarian region of the country, but because they had no railroad, they had no way to get things around fast, and food spoilage was a problem. Now, Josiah Gorgas was awesome for the South, and he found a way to get 600,000 European arms into the South through the blockade. Big W for them. He built gunpowder factories, arsenals, and gunworks across the South. Like I said, the Confederate government did not actually bargain with the railroads, and instead were free to offer them the appallingly shitty government rate, and they could interrupt whenever the military service was warranted, whatever that meant, in those nice vague terms, and run locomotive cars right into the ground. And by the end of the war, the South had pretty much destroyed any integrity of the railroads they had down there. While Lincoln struggled with his generals, the South had an awesome Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, and Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the big problem Jefferson Davis had, he was willing to keep standing behind his poor selections, even though they had screwed him time and time again. The only reason Davis was even considering allowing these boneheads to kind of run their operations was because he knew the supply of military talent was so limited as it was that he kind of had to deal from the bottom of the deck. Memminger, the Confederate Treasury Chief, was also a huge disaster. When the Federals captured New Orleans and the lots of coinage, he made no effort to make preventative measures to move it out of the hands of the Union, and he also made no effort to buy up the Southern cotton when they still had enough funds in 1861. By the time that they started thinking about it in 1862, it was too little too late, and they had no supply of cotton on hand, whereas if they had bought it in 1861, they could have had a fighting chance to at least convince Britain to try and intervene, as they would have continued the flow of cotton going in. So as a result, guess what he did? That's right, if you guessed, turned to the printing press and started hitting Control P desperately. He started printing the fuck out of those Confederate dollars, and the Confederate economy was sent into oblivion, and inflation ran rampant, and life in the Confederate South was fucking miserable. Also, the new Confederate Congress of the South was mostly full of amateurs, most of which who had not served in Congress while they were in the Union, and at best they were speaking for their local interests rather than the aggregate of the CSA as a whole. So rather than construct and try to get themselves out of this situation, the Congress became way more willing to criticize and destroy. One of the biggest takeaways that we find, and this is never mentioned of course in school, because school fucking sucks and doesn't emphasize the points that are really important in conflicts like this, the North found ways to contract and bargain with the private manufacturers, while the South just went in authoritatively, took what they wanted when they could, and it was completely and totally tyrannical, the way that they ignored the demands of the owners. Now, as good as Lincoln had it on the supply side of things, Lincoln had it terrible with his generals. Lincoln had McClellan and Burnside. Both were very hesitant and unsure of themselves and were very slow to make moves. On the contrary, General Robert E. Lee had James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson. All three of them were very decisive and could quickly move, and it was so powerful to the point where they might as well have been telepathic, because Lee could send his orders to either of them and leave the execution to both of them. However, this great strength of Lee's was also his Achilles heel. Should any of them die, he's gonna get screwed, because those are some big ass shoes he's got to fill. Stonewall Jackson was killed by his own men, who thought he was the enemy after doing a quick little scouting run, and this left a huge hole that was never filled. Now, when we look at Ulysses S. Grant and Nathan Bedford Forrest, Grant in the Union Army, Nathan Bedford with reformers being a supreme cavalry leader. Both were very tactically unstudied, but they were able to size up tactical situations and know how to respond quickly in an efficient manner. One of the most important things about the South, and generally, was that Lee was extremely aggressive when he was given the opportunity, because he and the others knew that if the South was way too passive, they would lose because their resources and manufacturing power absolutely sucked in comparison to the North. So even though the South really wanted to run out the clock and kind of make the Union come after them in a way that was a little bit too difficult and it was worth more and the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze, so to say, Lee also knew that if he sat on his laurels, it was going to be too close, it was going to be way too dangerous, because the Union would win a war of attrition with the South. Lee had a lot of resounding victories and upsets, you could say, but Gettysburg is finally what happened, and that was Lee's real first time getting defeated, and the Union finally saw him as someone who could be defeated instead of this invincible Southern general. And don't forget, Lee was part of Virginia, and Virginia was part of the Upper South, which meant that they weren't a super slaveholder South, but again, like, he didn't want to join the Union in suppressing the other Southerners. The two main cities of Chattanooga and Atlanta, where the two pieces of east-west rail line were actually connected and were near gun foundries of Selma and the powder works of Augusta, meant that Alabama and Georgia were the priority for the ability of the South to contribute to 2 more years of war. One of the biggest mistakes the South made during the war, they made draft exemptions for any families who owned more than 20 slaves. Now, obviously, the only type of people who owned more than 20 slaves were the ones who had the by far biggest interest in the war of maintaining slavery. And so, since they were exempted, the entire burden of the war fell on the shoulders of the common person who had very few slaves of their own. So this basically got the interest backwards. You have all the people with the slaves hardly fighting in the war, and you have all the people without the slaves fighting the war for them. This backfired in terms of morale, and also, it started to make the common person serving in the Confederate Army think if they had more to lose at the hands of the Southern planters or the Yankee Army in the North. Either way, this was pretty fucked up. Also in 1863, Congress approved Davis and the government to confiscate food and animals for the Confederate Army and reimburse them at the really shitty government rates. And not only did it start confiscating people's property, almost in an authoritarian fashion, it added on a 10% sales tax, 10% livestock tax, an 8% value-added tax on other agricultural products, and an income tax of 15% up to $10,000. Now, the irony of this is, even though this was wartime for the South, and they were being really bad in the terms of the 1860s back then, we still have it worse today. Look at all the taxes we're getting fucked with. Although the argument could be easily made that the inflation back then was way, way, way worse, and today our inflation sucks, but it's not devastating like it was in the South. Either way, at the end of the day, the lack of railroad really screwed the South. Even if they were able to get an abundance of food, they just simply had no way to get it to their armies. As a result, there were plenty of anti-war movements in the South as well. As many as 100,000 Southerners fled into the Union Army and fought for the Union. And for those who didn't fight, as the conditions of the South became way, way worse, with inflation, people owning 20 more slaves not being actually drafted, the people with few slaves fighting for them, and the government getting the right to authoritarianly confiscate plenty of property from its citizens, the South obviously became war-weary. As they were running out of manpower in 1864, Davis actually turned to arming the slaves to fight for their own slavery. Now we get to the topic of prisoners of war. So with supplies being as scarce as they were, obviously POWs got very little attention. I mean, why would you feed an enemy if you could feed your own army with the same supplies? So since conditions were so shitty, and it was a pain in the ass to watch enemies in your own territory under your own watch, the South and North generally elected to actually do POW trades. So when blacks started fighting for the North, blacks only made $10 versus the whites making $13, and blacks were generally given inferior equipment and weapons. Let's not even talk about medical services, which were fucking terrible already. So if you were a black man who was injured, you were really getting shafted. Overall, black soldiers died at a rate of 3 times when it came to diseases. Sadly, blacks were actually taunted by whites who were enlisting to try to save the nation, and who they were supposedly supposed to be fighting with side by side with a common goal. So even though the North was fighting for emancipation, this didn't mean that things were just hunky-dory in the North, and black-white relations were fantastic. As demonstrated by the book, they are actually really shitty. God forbid, if you were a black man fighting for the North and you got captured by the South, you were just sold into slavery. What a depressing and horrible thought. And sometimes they were just fucking outright executed. There was the massacre at Fort Pillow, where you had 600 Union soldiers, 200 of which were black, and after Fort Pillow had surrendered to the South, 200 or so black men were just straight up executed, and that was disgusting. Lincoln, as a response, said that for every black man executed, a Confederate soldier will be put onto public works, which is basically like torture for them. But either way, the colored troops ended up being a huge asset for the North in the long run. And even if racial tensions were pretty bad at the time, overall, blacks and whites got along more and more as time went on an aggregate level. They withdrew from white churches and formed their own congregation. That was a very basic right at the time for whites, but for blacks, to be able to do that, that was absolutely groundbreaking for them, especially when they weren't even considered citizens at the time. Still, they couldn't vote, and they couldn't go to schools that were publicly funded in the North. But the first black was able to actually go to the bar in front of the Supreme Court in 1865, even though they weren't citizens at the time, remember. And in the face of Dred Scott, this was a huge W for blacks. blacks. Moving on, this is one of the sad realities of war, but women don't actually have to fight war. So when women don't have to fight, and they kind of eat up the propaganda of the government, what do they typically say? They typically say men should go enlist, and if they don't enlist, they're not worthy of having a woman in a family. So men get shamed into fighting wars which they have no interest in, as in the case with the South wholeheartedly, just in order to have a chance to reproduce and have a family. If that is not one of the most fucked up things in all of human history, that has absolutely got to stop. And luckily, I think as a very quick side note, I think today, people are generally anti-war, especially my generation. I mean, we looked at Iraq and Afghanistan as a complete and total shit show. I mean, seriously, if you're a woman and you're going to shame a guy for not going to fight into Iraq and Afghanistan, it's like, seriously, we just invaded those countries unjustly to spread democracy. And you seriously think I should go spend my life fighting over there so that we don't have to fight them over here? Like, give me a fucking break. So given that women were shaming men into fighting in the army and not having a chance to reproduce unless they did so, men in the army obviously had no touch of women. This is a very common theme in history. So prostitution in the military camps was fucking ridiculously high. I have never heard that before, nor really have I thought about it, but it would make complete and total sense. Another big thing that the book touches on, that's always constant in history, that the local and state governments made generous promises of support for soldiers' families should they enlist, and little of that support ever showed up in meaningful doses. Of course, when resources are as scarce as they are, why the fuck would you pay for a soldier's family or try to give them resources when you need everything you can to make sure you win the war? Wow, who would have guessed the government had no intention of fulfilling a promise it made and lied to you so that people would enlist? That's a new one. So given that there was little support for the families, that meant that women were actually the ones doing a lot of the plow work, especially in the South, on the farms that their husbands had left because there was no one else to do it except for the women. And remember, this is kind of a patriarchal society at the time, where a woman has basically no rights. I mean, once she's married, everything has to be done with a man's signature, legally. So once all these men had disappeared from their industries to go fight the war, guess what women started to actually be able to do? Many of the male-dominated industries actually started accepting women, more out of desperation than anything. Now, also in the South, women had it pretty rough. With their husbands gone, if they did own slaves, slaves found it way easier to ignore their orders, and women actually found sexual comfort with their slaves. Is that not pretty fucked up? You go to fight a war elsewhere, and your wife's been hooking up with the slave in the meantime. Oof. Rough one. As the war came closer and closer to end, the Union soldiers obviously went through the cities of the South, and the southern cities basically were totally destitute because all resources had been poured into fighting the war and trying to maintain independence. Also, the relationship with God changed during this war, with the reality and brutality of war, and the immorality running rampant in camps, and the amount of death that was caused in just a few short years. Many started to doubt how an all-loving God could allow for such things. Now, focusing a little more on the North, General Grant, Ulysses Grant had some problems, mainly with the fact that these 3-year enlistees in 1864 had their terms coming to an end, and after all the brutalities of war, why the hell would you re-sign up for this? So unless you had a very smashing win soon, a lot of people in the army were going to desert him, and the effort as a whole might actually falter. So Grant obviously knew that Richmond was a huge depot with rail links that were crucial to the success of the South, and trying to get General Lee out in the open was a huge pain in the ass, so they had to tango, trying to outflank each other over and over and over again until they got to Richmond. And even though there were so many chances the Union had to knock out the South for good, Grant finally did so. And I'm making this sound super simple, but they took the city of Richmond. The Army of Virginia with Lee had no more access to food and any support that they were already getting, meaning that their army was going to face starvation, and at the end of the day, Lee found it inevitable and threw in the towel. Also, an important point in the 1864 election was, if Lincoln's this president, and he's been waging war for a few years, does he have anything to show for it? Given that the war was still going on and the end wasn't necessarily in sight, Lincoln could actually be ousted for someone who would want peace. With this in mind, that means Grant had to start getting really aggressive. Now, something good that happened is, even though General Sherman was not that great when he was actually general, when he was under Ulysses S. Grant, his tune changed a little into an awesome number 2. He started making decisions faster and more ably, which was not the case when he had served as the commander. So after the war, this brings up some really strange questions, and it comes to the legality of how the North will reaccumulate the South into the Union. So remember, the Treaty of Versailles after World War I absolutely tore the German economy to shreds, and those brutal terms could also be enacted here, where the North could try to pilfer and pillage the already destitute South. And also, how would Reconstruction take in place general? And given that Roger Taney, the Supreme Court antithesis of Lincoln, was still alive and able to make ruling until his death in October of 1864, emancipation could actually be denied. Also, strangely, the book brings up an excellent thought, and furthermore, even though racial segregation was common in the North at the time, emancipation could actually backfire, and whites may vote against the interests of blacks and not want to promote them to citizens because racial unity as a whole was still light years away. Why would they want to vote for someone who's promoting this idea? That would mean that the whites who think of themselves as superior must now integrate with the blacks who they don't think are worth it at all, and it would force them to integrate with the blacks, whereas they kind of like things the way they were back then. Of course, that's just for the people who think that way, but the point stands nonetheless, this could have actually backfired on Lincoln. And one more funny argument the book brings up is that, kind of in similar terms with today, how if women are underpaid so much, then why doesn't the market just hire a bunch of women because they're cheaper labor? Whites would have been very unhappy if the market was suddenly flooded with all these blacks who were just straight up cheaper labor and could actually outcompete whites. However, at the end of the day, even if they were still freed, blacks could basically be kept in slavery, more or less, and the wrong people acting. Now, some interesting points about the draft that I'd never known. Out of 292,000 names that were pulled, only 10,000 ever actually had to serve. There were many ways to get around it, such as hiring a substitute, and a $300 fee could also be paid. The most notable one was in New York, and the most fucked up thing about this anti-riot draft in New York, demonstrating that racial tensions were dog shit back then, even though this riot was about anti-draft measures, the mob took their anger and burned down a black orphanage. Mobthink and groupthink in humans is usually not a good thing, and there were plenty of times in the war when there were protests to shortages, protests to other stuff, and they ended up being giant riots and looting fests. Sherman's march across Georgia was a fatal blow to the South, and this gave up a lot of the railroads that were already on thin ice for the South. So once this railroad fell, Lee's supplies for the Army of Virginia started to really devastate them, and they actually started having desertions. About 8% of Lee's army left, with tens of people doing so every day. So the effects of the war. 1 in 10 white men by 1865 were dead from some war cause, and even though the figure of 360,000 Union Army deaths was reported, this is an approximation, and it's well known that these could have been underreported by as high as 20%. So it could have been well into the 400,000s for the Union deaths. So 110,000 were actually killed in war, 250,000 died from some sort of disease. Don't forget, at the time, battle death is looked at way more favorably than disease death. Battle death is honorable. Disease death is seen as total weakness, and you died on the bed with no glory, which is really sad, because that means 250,000 people died that way, at least from the figure that the Union reported. There was also no grave registration in the same way that we saw World War II, so a lot of people died graveless, and even though there were efforts to try to get dead bodies to their families, as the war went on further and further and the death pile counted up, people started being put in half-assed mass graves and stuff like that, rather than given the individual burial that they probably deserved, and don't even think that they were buried in coffins, because of course everything's going towards the Union war effort. So people used like cracker boxes, for example, to help mark people's graves and stuff like that. It was really sad. One of the main reasons for underreporting deaths is you do not want to blow the morale of your own troops back home. If they see bigger and bigger numbers, they're going to be like, oh shit, we're losing, and then you're going to have less people enlist. So it's to the benefit of both armies to underreport their deaths. 1 out of every 65 Northerners was dead. So something we never learned is that the government was actually busy paying out pensions to people who had served in the war. Astoundingly, it made 11% of the federal budget, and by 1903, it was as high as 22% of the federal budget, which is fucking nuts because we never hear anything about this. Which of course is kind of like Medicare and Social Security, which eat huge amounts of the federal budget, but 22% for the government back then was nuts. The North got off scot-free compared to the South, however. Even though the Southern number of deaths is way smaller, it's very suspicious how they kept their records. And of course, they wanted to underreport as well to make sure that the morale of the South wasn't going to be blown at any moment. Even though between 74 to 94,000 people died from combat and 110 to 160,000 died from disease, they had a much smaller population, so they actually had 3 times the death rate of the North. 18 out of 100 soldiers that went never actually came back home. One of the biggest losses the South experienced was after emancipation. One of the biggest assets the South had were the actual slaves on their books. So when you emancipate them all, 33% of your entire asset base just disappears overnight. So the South got absolutely screwed in that sense. Next, as I had mentioned before, the South also ran up a huge deficit. The South also ran up a huge war debt, and the Union had zero interest in trying to assume that. Why the hell would you pay off a war that you were fighting against yourself? 43% of the remaining assets were destroyed, and that includes horses, mules, cattle, and the lack of slave labor made sure that Southern property generally lost about half of its net value. It was so bad in Alabama that farmers lost 84% of what their net value had been by the end of the war. So by holding on to that 16%, they basically lost 5/6 of everything they were worth by the time the war began. Georgia also saw 25% of its total rail twisted into useless dog shit, which is a huge loss for them, of course. One of the worst things that we do not get taught in school, that this book did an excellent job of describing, is that the horrible irony is that if the South had accepted emancipation and phased out slavery just like the Founding Fathers intended, with a buyout plan that Lincoln had devised, they could have had $6.6 billion. They could have, with the $6.6 billion that they burned in the Civil War, bought a mule for every family and 40 acres, and still had a $3.5 billion surplus, which would have allowed blacks to enter the market without too much turbulence. But because they decided to do things the hard way, they lost almost everything they had. And this shows one of the tragedies of humankind. Rather than do things the easy way, without a war, and by kind of saying, this slave, and by saying, and by looking at the in moment easy decision of let's hold on to slavery no matter what, rather than buying them out, they would rather spend all this shitload of money and kill all these people in a civil war rather than buy blacks out, let them enter the market freely, which was a radical idea back then, I get it, and save billions of dollars, which back then was a lot more money, and have a lot more people alive. We're seeing the same exact horseshit today. We cannot make the easy decision as a society to stop kicking the can down the road and just deal with the problems now so that the next generation or the people that come after us won't look at us and be like, why the fuck did they do things that way? I mean, look at Social Security and Medicare. We look at the people who started that shit like that's the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. You guys suck. If we had just done things the easy way and not started that, even though we were in a massive Great Depression at the time, look what it's costing us 80 years later. We're destroying ourselves with that unfunded liabilities that the government has set up, and if we don't get rid of them, we will just bankrupt the shit out of ourselves, which is not too far away. Something else the South did in the war is it vastly underestimated how quickly European powers would switch their suppliers from the South to other places to find their source of cotton. Brazil, India, and Egypt ended up making shitloads of money in place of what the South was able to export. Overall, we have to remember that war is rarely anyone's friend, and even with the South with its super king cotton exporting, the northern industry was also hit because a lot of it had switched to just wartime production. So once wartime production's done and you get to a peacetime economy, manufacturing didn't show a boom in anywhere except for a few narrow industries. So many wool mills and small-scale iron mills had been sacrificed in the name of trying to make these big wartime production. Now, with the invention of the railroad, and because of how powerful it was, 33% of all post-war iron making went directly to rail line, and the South actually showed a fantastic rail recovery. At the same time, it killed small-scale iron making because now you needed this whole shitload of rail to be made, and small scale is not going to be able to do it. So hence why the corporations took off after the 1870s. Before the Civil War, 7% of American manufacturing was from corporations, but the corporation had accounted for 69% of all manufacturing. That shift in 40 years is massive, and a lot of it still stands today. So one of the best things that happened with the Civil War is we ended this hideous contradiction that America had. We're this free constitutional republic, but we still have slavery, and so it gave validity to the United States of America that we got rid of it, and the monarchy started getting a little nervous over on the other side of the Atlantic. So another thing that we learn in school is that emancipation was passed, but it doesn't tell us the exact manner that it was passed. For example, in school, they give the impression that emancipation was passed completely and totally by everyone, and everyone rode off into the sunset all hunky-dory. However, the book does an excellent job of portraying, since the Supreme Court posed a challenge to emancipation, the only other for sure way to get this emancipation through into law without bigger problems was they could pass an amendment. However, at that time, 80 years after the country was founded, the Constitution had only been amended 12 times before, and Congress generally didn't agree upon amendments. So trying to get an amendment through Congress was not the easiest thing to do. However, as we know that's what happened. But on January 31st, 1865, as the war was coming to a close, emancipation was passed with only 3 votes to spare. It was barely passed. So one of the best things the United States has ever done. One of the most amazing bills for the West. And remember, with the European monarchies being in power, the U.S. managed to pass this barely, and proves a point that I want to bring up. Just because something looks great and it's great for civil rights or whatever it is, doesn't mean it's going to get passed unanimously in the moment. I mean, look at what Donald Trump represents, and he barely got into office with the election of 2024. A lot of people say that it was a complete and total landslide, but when you have the swing states total to an amount of about 200,000 votes or so, determining the direction a country of 330 or so million people are going to go, I wouldn't consider that a landslide. I'd consider that barely scraping by. So overall, just because something's good does not mean that it's going to get passed through unanimously in the moment, especially because it will have its challenges usually. However, we can retroactively look back at something like that and be like, oh, slavery, of course it was easy, right? But at the time, it was actually very challenging for the reasons I mentioned. When it came to emancipation as well, how does the Union make sure that the South is actually going to respect these laws and also make sure that slavery isn't just going to be enforced the second the Union leaves? Hence why the federal occupation occurred into the South during Reconstruction. However, with the black codes of certain states like Mississippi, it might as well have been slavery since blacks still couldn't serve on juries or offer testimony against whites, yikes, and they couldn't have firearms or knives, and they were prohibited to marry, and interracial marriage was forbidden. So when the time came, a lot of old Confederates actually went back to their old posts sometimes of serving in their state and whatnot, and therefore there was a lot of violence against black from whites, and that's one of the sad facts of the country. Some other constitutions to consider about the Confederates now that they had lost. What's the constitutional status of a Confederate state? Do they just return to the status quo, no problem? Are they a conquered territory? What's the legal status of a freed slave? Does that automatically mean that they're citizens now? Or are they kind of this in-between second-class citizen still, yet still more powerful than a slave? And then, really, what overall was a citizen? And one of the worst aspects the Confederate represented was one of the worst economies possible, because they had devastated themselves trying to fight off the Union. And of course, they had turned to the printing press. They had authoritatively stolen much of the property of the Southern citizens, and now the Union's supposed to annex them and pay for the war against themselves? That seems kind of stupid. Now, once the war had actually ended, Lincoln was killed a few days later. And this represents the death of what Lincoln was trying to set into motion, because Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had very different views than Lincoln did. Lincoln had chosen him to extend an olive branch to the other side, of course, but Johnson was completely and totally against black. So with Lincoln being assassinated, Johnson assumes power, and he's extremely Jacksonian. And what I mean by Jacksonian, he's very, very pro-union, despite the fact that he's fighting against slave states. There were plenty of Democrats in the day who thought blacks were the worst thing ever, but would rather have a union than separate and keep slavery. Because don't forget, slavery often only benefited the very rich. Also, with Lincoln and the status of the Confederates, he was trying to assume them a little bit more peacefully, rather than Johnson, who wanted to iron fist them in. He was a little bit more on the side of like the Treaty of Versailles, where it was just bear down the world on your enemy and treat them like a complete and total destroyed, conquered enemy territory. Lincoln was also quite good at navigating Congress, but Johnson was completely and totally known for butting heads, and eventually he would find himself impeached because he was such a pain in the ass to deal with. Congress went as far as to hamstring him and make sure that they actually answered to Grant rather than Johnson, and Grant was also not that bad politically, because he found ways to sidestep Johnson. Grant and Lincoln saw eye to eye way more than Grant and Johnson. Once the war had ended, this is of course the Reconstruction moment, the South saw that 2,000 black men now were in some sort of political power in the South, which was mind-blowing, because only a few years earlier, of course, they were just slaves. Also, with a major war-torn South, the Reconstruction governments spent money on a huge scale and also raised Southern taxes very steeply. Roads, rail lines, and harbors were totally trashed by the war, and trying to rebuild, with an already devastated people and economy, saw no other option than them to eventually turn to monster tax increases, which I'm sure the people were fucking pissed off about. So not only were taxes 3 to 5 times higher than they were pre-war, there was also a lot less work to go around, and then in the end, the Southern citizens generally got fucked. So by 1870, all the states were readmitted to the Union, and the United States found themselves trying their absolute best to make sure that ex-Confederates didn't come into power, and also make sure that the Union troops stationed in the South were there to enforce the new civil rights statutes that previous Southern Confederates would never have even thought of. Of course, remember, blacks going from slaves to citizens and even holding political power in some cases doesn't just happen overnight without some serious friction of the people who had already believed that they were an underclass. So from 1869 to 1877, when Grant was president, people were generally starting to lose interest in Reconstruction and requested to make sure that Union troops in the South, and when they were asked for assistance, was seen as irritating rather than trying to enforce things that the Civil War won. Don't forget, when a new generation comes along, they don't even know what the Civil War really was. Their priority is not dealing with the Civil War. They just kind of think, this Reconstruction shit, fuck that. Some of the worst things that happened during federal occupation of the southern states. Let's not pretend that the South was just completely and totally a free place, because from 1890 to 1908, the Jim Crow laws were absolutely brutal to Southern blacks. It ensured that they got the poorest housing, worst education, and were thrown into political nothingness. So it was definitely a step back by those measures, and it's definitely worth measuring. So that's the in-depth account of the Civil War, and this took me forever to make, but it was really worth making because I've never given the Civil War, or really the events of the 19th century, the credit that they're probably due, because as someone who's born at the end of the 21st century, really all I think about is, well, the 21st century. But the events of the Civil War were so profound and changed this country for a lot of things. And once again, if you can read this book, I highly just recommend reading it. It wasn't that expensive, and the narrative is absolutely gripping, and I can't do it justice even in this video. It's very easy to read, highly digestible, and at no point did I really find myself being bored. Rather, I found that the author's fascination with the topics and the way that he demonstrated them was amazing and entirely engaging. So as you can see, there's a lot of conclusions to be made about the Civil War. I'll let you make some of your own, but I've tried to give you the most amount of facts I can, and hopefully we know better than to have a Civil War this time. But the way that things are going, I just don't see how it's avoidable. Things are too tense. Democrats do not want to work with Republicans. They basically ran on open borders. They used the media to lie, and after all the nonsense from COVID and that absolute waste of 2 fucking years, I just don't see how we go back to living in a normal society. And there's probably going to be a boiling point or a climax where I don't know if Civil War will start. I just don't see how things get de-escalated slowly with multiple presidents all working in the best interest of the people in terms of restricting the government. I just feel like something like that's more or less inevitable at this point, right?